Hi guys, and welcome to Calm Night Radio Channel. Tonight we step into a cotton field before dawn, into a world where the air is cool for only a moment and the ground still holds the night. You can barely see the rows ahead, yet the day has already begun without asking your permission. What does it feel like to wake when stars are still out? To tie your life to a plant that tears your fingers and enriches someone else? And how did so many black Americans in 1850 keep going, day after day, under a system designed to take everything it could from body and spirit? So, before you settle into the story, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. And while you are here, comment your location and your local time. Now, dim the lights and let your breathing slow as you enter the half-dark edge of a southern plantation where the cabins sit low to the earth and the first sounds of morning are not bird, but movement. You wake on a pallet stuffed with corn husks or rough straw, covered by a blanket that never feels warm enough in winter and too heavy in summer. The room is close and stale. Smoke from last night's fire still lingers in the boards, and the smell of damp wood settles into everything. Several people share the space, sometimes a whole family, sometimes more than one. Sleep is never deep for long. A baby coughs. Someone turns over. A door creaks open somewhere outside. Soon enough, there is no question of staying down. In 1850, cotton sits at the centre of the American economy, especially across the Deep South. It is not simply a crop. It is a machine made of land, money, shipping, credit, and forced labour. Enslaved black Americans keep that machine moving with their hands, their backs, their feet, and their time. The cotton plant itself looks almost ordinary from a distance, just rows of green in season. But by harvest, it becomes a field of white bowls that promise wealth to planters and pain to the people ordered to gather them. A great deal of the world's cotton cloth depends on these fields. That is the cold arithmetic beneath the sunrise. You rise because others rise. There is no gentle start. Morning comes as command. In some places a horn sounds, low and rough in the dark. In others it is a bell, or the call of a driver, or the tread of someone already moving down the path between cabins. The sound slides through the air and into your bones. It means the same thing every time. Get up, dress fast, and be ready. No one asks whether you slept. No one asks whether you ache. The day does not wait, and certainly not for you. Your clothes are simple and worn from work. Coarse fabric rubs the skin. Shoes, if you have them, may already be splitting at the seams. Many enslaved people received limited clothing each year, sometimes with rough wool for winter and plain cotton or linen for summer, though quality varied widely. Children could go with very little. Cloth had to last through field work, weather, and constant repair. Needles and thread mattered more than elegance. A patched shirt was not a sign of style. It was proof of survival. Outside, the air before sunrise has a softness the day will soon burn away. The dirt is cool underfoot. Dew clings to grass near the cabins, and for a brief moment the plantation seems quiet. Then you hear iron pots shifting, murmured voices, a cough, the scrape of a hoe being lifted. Food before work is small and practical. Cornmeal is common. Pork might appear in rations, though not always in a generous amount. And some people stretch whatever they can with greens, sweet potatoes, or food from small garden patches when allowed. Historians know a good deal about plantation rations from records and recollections, but they still debate how much planters actually provided compared with how much enslaved people had to secure for themselves through gardening, hunting, fishing, or exchange. You eat quickly because there is no luxury in lingering. The food is plain. It fills only part of what the body will spend. Yet even in these narrow moments, skill and care appear. A woman can turn coarse meal into something warm and edible in near darkness. Someone saves drippings. Someone shares a bite with a child. Someone jokes in a whisper sharp enough to make another person snort with tired laughter. That matters, not because it changes the structure of slavery, which it does not, but because it keeps personhood alive inside it. Soon the cabins empty into the path. You walk with others toward the fields, your body still half asleep. The sky begins to pale at the edges. Rows spread out ahead, long and strict. planted for efficiency rather than beauty. Cotton requires exhausting labour through much of the year. Land must be cleared and broken, seeds must be planted, weeds must be cut back, soil must be hoed, worms and pests must be watched. Then, when picking season arrives, the pace becomes relentless. In 1850, enslaved workers do not simply appear for harvest. They have already carried the crop through months of hard agricultural labour. The field has its own smell. Earth, wet leaves, trampled stems, sweat not yet fresh but remembered in cloth from yesterday. When the sun rises higher, another scent comes with it. Warm dust and heated plants. The cotton boll is soft to look at, almost innocent, but its dried husk is sharp. Fingers split on it, wrists catch on it, sleeves drag against it. You learn the texture with your skin. There is no romantic mystery in the work once your hands know what the plant can do. People often picture cotton labour as picking alone, but much of the work is deeply organised. Plantations usually divided labour into groups, often called gangs, arranged by age, strength, and physical ability. The strongest adults might form the first gang, expected to maintain the fastest pace in heavy field labour. Others, including elders or younger children, could be assigned to lighter work, though lighter is a very generous word here. Even a smaller burden remains a burden. An entire social world develops under this structure, shaped by command yet also by human observation. You know who keeps rhythm, you know who encourages others, you know who has a limp, who protects a younger child, who can make a story out of almost nothing. A strange little detail shows up in some accounts from the cotton South. People tucked odd objects into pockets or tied small charms into clothing. Roots, coins, scraps, carved bits, things that might seem tiny and private against such a giant system. Some were spiritual protections, some family keepsakes, some personal habits. Not every observer understood them, and many records are filtered through hostile or confused white writers, so certainty is hard. Still, these glimpses matter. They remind you that the people in the field were not blank figures in a ledger. They carried memory, belief, style, and inner life, even when the archive only catches the corner of it. As light spreads, the plantation becomes fully visible. The big house, if there is one, stands apart. Storage buildings and gin houses mark the landscape of profit. Wagons wait. Fences cut the land into ownership. Nothing around you is arranged for your comfort. Everything is arranged for output. That is the logic of the place. Cotton moves from field to gin, from bale to river or rail, from American ports to northern mills and British factories. Each stage translates your labour into somebody else's calculation. You do not need to see a shipping manifest to understand that your work travels far beyond your sight. And yet the day begins, as days usually do, in immediate things. A child rubbing sleep from sore eyes, a mother tightening a head wrap, a man flexing his stiff fingers before gripping a hoe. The work rhythm does not erase personality. It crushes, limits, and disciplines, but it does not fully erase. People talk when they can. Songs rise in fragments. Some are spiritual, some practical, some playful, some impossible to classify neatly. The sound may keep time. It may lift spirits. It may carry meanings not meant for the ears of an overseer. Scholars disagree on exactly how often work songs accompanied cotton labour in every region, because evidence varies. But there is no doubt that music and vocal rhythm formed an important part of many enslaved communities. When the first labour begins, the body protests. Your shoulders tighten. Your stomach settles into that dull awareness that food will not be enough. Your hands know what is coming, which may be the worst part. Anticipation can be its own ache. A field hand in 1850 lives under repeated strain, and the body adapts only by wearing down. Muscles grow used to motion but not free from injury. Skin hardens but still breaks. Fatigue becomes almost ordinary, which is a deeply unfair thing for any human being to accept as normal. By now the sun has climbed enough to soften the last of the cool air. Light falls on the white cotton and makes it almost glow. It can look beautiful from a distance. That is one of the history's nastier tricks. A lovely scene can hide a brutal reality with embarrassing ease. Travellers sometimes wrote admiringly about southern landscapes, all while gliding past the fact that the beauty depended on coercion. You, standing in the row itself, do not have that luxury. Beauty is beside the point when the day is measured in labour. There is another pressure here, one less visible than a hand or whip but always present. Time. Not time as poetry, not time as a clock on a mantle, but time as ownership. Enslaved people in the cotton South had very little control over the shape of their hours. Dawn, work, meals, tasks, movement, sleep. All could be ordered from outside the self. Even private life was exposed to interruption. That theft of time is one of slavery's cruelest features. It reaches beyond work into identity. If your hours are not yours, what part of the day can truly belong to you? Still, people made claims where they could. A few extra moments by the fire, a whispered prayer, a braid done carefully, a hidden lesson taught to a child, a seed planted near a cabin, a joke sharpened into resistance. These are not sentimental decorations. They are ways of remaining human in conditions built to deny full humanity. No one should have had to perform such miracles simply to preserve the self, yet there they are, all through the record if you know how to look. So you stand at the opening of the day in 1850 in a cotton world already humming with demand. The ground is waking under the sun. The rows wait in strict lines. The people beside you carry hunger, memory, fear, endurance, and skill into the field. The labour ahead is hard, but the fact that it will be done does not come from willingness. It comes from force, routine, and the terrible durability of a system designed to keep bodies working from first light onward, and in that first hour, before the full heat rises, you can already feel the central truth of the plantation. Cotton does not merely grow here, it is pulled from the land by lives compelled to serve it. By full morning, the field has lost its softness. The gentle blue at the edge of the sky is gone, replaced by a brighter light that exposes everything. Rows of cotton stretch outward with a kind of stern order, and you begin to understand that this landscape is not merely agricultural, it is disciplinary. The plants are spaced for labour, the paths are cut for movement, and the people moving through them are expected to do the same thing in the same rhythm for hour after hour. Even the silence feels arranged. You take your place within a gang, one of the basic labour groups used on many cotton plantations in 1850. This is not a casual gathering. It is a system designed to squeeze the most work from every body available. On many plantations, the strongest adults are placed in the first gang, where the pace is hardest and the expectations highest. Another group follows with people judged less able to keep that speed, perhaps because of age, illness, pregnancy, or youth. Very small children may be kept to lighter tasks nearby, carrying water, watching babies, or helping in whatever ways adults decide they can manage. The words may sound clinical now, but on the ground they mean something simple and cruel. Your worth is measured by how much labour can be pulled from you. The work this morning is not yet the frantic motion of heavy picking season. Cotton demands attention through much of the year. If the plants are still growing, you hoe between rows, chop weeds, and loosen the crusted earth around the stalks. You bend, lift, strike, step, and repeat. The hoe handle rubs your palms. Dust kicks up around your ankles. Each swing lands with a dry thud that soon becomes the beat of the morning. You do not need a clock to know time is passing. Your shoulders will tell you. A driver or overseer watches the movement of the line. On some plantations, the driver is an enslaved man placed in authority over others, expected to keep labour moving under impossible demands. It is one of slavery's bitter distortions, pressing one trapped person into the management of another. On other places, the overseer takes a more direct role, mounted on horseback or walking the rows with a cane, whip, or ledger. Historians agree that supervision varied from plantation to plantation, but the basic principle did not. Work had to be visible, measurable, and constant. Idleness, or anything called idleness by those in power, invited correction. The cotton field has a soundscape of its own. Hoes scrape and strike, leaves brush against cloth, someone clears a throat, someone breathes through clenched teeth. Insects drone from the edges of the field. Boots or bare feet shuffle the loosened dirt. A voice carries from one row to another, brief and low. The field is not loud in the way a factory is loud, yet it surrounds you with repetition until the mind almost floats on it. That may be one reason songs, chants, and murmured rhythms mattered. A repeated phrase can steady breathing. A shared line can soften isolation. Sometimes the sound is no more than a hum under the breath. Sometimes it sharpens into a call answered by another voice farther down the row. There is an old temptation in popular storytelling to imagine all enslaved field labour as a single mass of suffering without variation. The suffering was real and immense, but the daily experience also contained skill, judgment, and adaptation. Cotton cultivation required knowledge. You had to know when a row had been chopped cleanly, when weeds would return, when a plant needed care, when soil had gone too hard, when rain had changed the condition of the ground. Enslaved workers carried agricultural expertise that planters depended upon, even while refusing to recognize that expertise as anything worthy of freedom or respect. That contradiction sits at the center of the plantation economy. The people treated as property were often the people who best understood how to make the land productive. You move with a gang, and the shape of authority becomes visible in tiny gestures. No one wants to fall behind. Falling behind can bring punishment, humiliation, or extra attention. So you watch the person nearest you. You keep pace with the nearest shoulders. Labour becomes social in a difficult way. Cooperation helps survival, but the system also uses comparison to increase pressure. A faster worker can become the standard for everyone else. A slower worker can bring anger down the row. Every plantation had its own local customs, but across much of the cotton south the message was familiar. Keep up, keep moving, do not invite notice. Notice can arrive for very small reasons. Straighten your back too long, and someone sees. Stop to shake dirt from a shoe, and someone remarks on it. Let your mind drift, and your hands slow before you realize it. The field teaches a harsh intimacy with your own motions. You become aware of how long it takes to wipe sweat from your forehead. You measure the cost of taking a fuller breath. You discover that a body under supervision learns strange mathematics, counting effort in heartbeats and glances. The sun climbs. The coolness disappears from the air and leaves behind warmth that gathers slowly on your neck. Cotton country in summer and early fall can be punishing. Heat presses on the scalp, settles in clothing, and lifts the smell of soil until the whole field feels baked. Sweat runs down the spine. Dust sticks to the damp places behind your knees and along your wrists. The touch of your shirt becomes irritating, then nearly unbearable. Yet the gang keeps moving. The field does not care whether you're comfortable. The plantation cares even less. Breakfast has long since faded from your stomach. Hunger becomes a background condition. That may sound dramatic, but many enslaved people lived close to the edge of nutritional sufficiency, especially during periods of intense labour. Cornmeal, salt pork, molasses, and seasonal vegetables might sustain life, but not always robust health. Some planters boasted about feeding their enslaved workforce well, usually in records meant to present themselves favourably. Personal accounts and plantation records together suggest a more uneven and often harsher truth. Enough to work did not mean enough to thrive. Bodies can be kept functional while still being underfed. You also notice the different ages within the work world. Children are there, not as decoration, but as participants in labour. A child may start with small duties, scaring birds, carrying water, minding infants, gathering fuel, picking up scraps. As they grow, the tasks grow. By the early teenage years, many are drawn more fully into field labour. There is no protected realm called childhood here, at least not one recognised by the plantation. Families still tried to create tenderness, play, and instruction where they could. But slavery kept reaching in to claim more of each young body. That is one of the most chilling features of the cotton system. It trained the next generation for exploitation almost from the moment they could be useful. And still, even in such a place, personality flickers through. One person works with stubborn quiet. Another mutters observation sharp enough to make others hide a smile. Someone has a graceful way of lifting and dropping the hoe, almost elegant despite the misery of the task. Someone else keeps a private rhythm with the heel of a foot. These details matter because they reveal what slavery tried and failed to extinguish. Uniform labour did not create uniform people. Some accounts from the antebellum South mention workers wearing hats braided from straw or rough plant fibres in especially hot months. It was practical, of course, but also a reminder of improvised craft. Plantation-issue clothing rarely met every need, so people adapted with what they had. A scrap of cloth became a head wrap, a broken tool handle got reworked, a gourd became a dipper, a cabin corner became storage for dried herbs or hidden keepsakes. None of this was quaint. It was intelligence under pressure. There is also the problem of uncertainty, which hangs over much of what historians reconstruct. Plantation journals, account books, and letters can tell you how owners wanted labour to function, but not always how it felt from inside the row. Formerly enslaved people left testimonies, and those voices are invaluable, yet memory is shaped by time, trauma, and the circumstances of telling. Scholars continue to debate how closely planter records reflect actual daily practice, especially on smaller properties where documentation could be thin or self-serving. That uncertainty does not weaken the story. It actually deepens it. It reminds you that the archive was built by unequal power, and that some truths survive only in fragments. As the morning wears on, the gang begins to move with a grim steadiness. The first stiffness has passed, replaced by that dangerous state where pain becomes ordinary enough to ignore. Arms rise and fall, feet shift down the row, dirt loosens, weeds fall. The body learns to continue because stopping is costly. You might think endurance is a grand heroic thing, shining and noble. Often it is not. Often it is simply dull persistence. Another stroke, another step, another breath through the heat. The overseer, if he is close, may seem almost bored. That is its own horror. A human life reduced to routine can look ordinary to the person benefiting from it. He checks progress, marks output, issues an order, perhaps scolds or threatens. Then he moves along. For him, this is management. For you, it is the architecture of the day. The difference between those two positions is the difference between command and captivity. Around midday, the field shimmers. The air above the rows begins to waver. Your hands feel swollen around the tool. Muscles in the lower back pull tight. You shift your weight for relief and discover there is no relief, only slightly different discomfort. The smell now is hot cotton leaves, sunlit dust, and sweat drying into cloth. Nearby, someone coughs the dry cough of a throat full of dust. Another person pauses just long enough to press a hand against the small of the back. Nothing about this is accidental. The plantation has organized the field so that labor can continue despite pain. Not because pain is absent. This organization extends beyond the work itself. The gang system also creates a visible hierarchy of labor that owners and overseers can read at a glance. Who is strongest? Who is young enough to train? Who is ill? Who is pregnant? Who is slowed with age? The line becomes a report written in moving bodies. That is why being seen in the field carried so much weight. It was not just supervision, it was classification. Yet classification never tells the whole truth. A person marked weak may be the sharpest thinker in the row. A child sent on errands may be absorbing every detail of adult behavior. A tired worker may be quietly preserving energy in ways an overseer cannot read. Beneath the apparent order lies a hidden world of judgment and strategy. How much effort to show, when to speak, when silence is safest. Who can be trusted with a whispered sentence? Which path back to the quarters offers a chance to gather berries, greens, or news? By the time the sun stands high, you have learned something essential about the field gang. It is not just a labour unit. It is a forced society. People are placed together, watched together, compared together, and driven together. Within that pressure, relationships form, tensions rise, kindness appears, and resentment occasionally flashes. The system wants output. Human beings create something more complex, even when they are denied the freedom to shape their own circumstances. So the morning passes in rows and motion, under a widening sky and a hardening heat. Cotton labour in 1850 is not random toil. It is organised with care by people who profit from it, and endured with care by people who must survive it. You feel that difference in every part of the field. One side arranges, the other side bears, and in that unequal arrangement, the gang moves forward, line by line, carrying the plantation through another long day. By the height of picking season, the field changes character again. The cotton is open now, white bursting from dry brown husks, and the rows look almost festive from far away, which is a very rude trick of the eye. Up close, nothing feels festive. The bolls catch your fingers with sharp edges. The plants tug at your sleeves. The sack you drag behind you whispers over dirt and stubble like a stubborn second shadow. This is the season many people picture first when they think about southern cotton, because the white fluff is so visible. It is also the season when the pressure can become merciless. You're no longer swinging a hoe for most of the day. Now you move down the row with both hands busy, reaching, pulling, clearing, dropping, reach, pull, drop, reach, pull, drop. The motion sounds simple, and that is part of its cruelty. Any task repeated enough can look easy to someone who is not doing it. Picking cotton is not easy. It is relentless, detailed work, demanding both speed and care. You cannot simply tear at the plant wildly. Trash in the cotton lowers its value. Green leaves, stems, dampness, bits of husk. All can bring complaint. Owners want quantity, but they also want a crop clean enough to gin and bale profitably. So the labourer must be fast, precise, and tireless, which is a charming set of demands to make of an exhausted human being. Each picker carries a sack, often made of coarse cloth, slung over the shoulder or tied around the waist and trailing behind. At first it feels light. That is deceptive. As the morning advances, the sack grows heavy, pulling at the hips and lower back. You bend, straighten, step, and drag. The cotton itself is soft in your palm for an instant. Then the bowl reminds you what surrounds that softness. Fingers split, nails crack. Tiny cuts open at the tips and along the sides of the thumb. Cotton fibres cling to sweat. Dust works into the cuts. By midday your hands can feel hot and raw, as if the field is slowly sanding away your skin. The pressure comes not only from the task, but from measurement. Picking is easy to weigh, which means it is easy to turn into numbers, and numbers become quotas. On many plantations, especially larger ones, the amount each person picked in a day could be weighed and compared. A strong adult might be expected to bring in a very large amount, though the exact number varied by region, season, field conditions, and the ambitions of the owner. Children and elderly people would generally be expected to pick less, but less did not mean gently. It meant a smaller burden inside the same cruel logic. Your day can be reduced to pounds on a scale, and once that happens, everybody in the field risks becoming a contest. That contest is false, of course. It is not fair competition among free workers. It is coerced labour made visible in public numbers. Still, the comparison matters. A large basket or a heavy sack can be used to shame those who fall short. An overseer can praise one worker only to squeeze harder on 10 others. A planter can announce a target as though ambition were the issue, not bondage. The arithmetic turns suffering into management language. Underperforming, short weight, lazy hand. People with power always seem to discover very tidy words for other people's pain. The weighing itself can feel like a ritual of exposure. Cotton is emptied, examined, weighed, and recorded. Your entire day comes down to a figure someone else writes down. That figure may shape the evening, the next day's threats, or the reputation that follows you through the season. Some testimonies describe the dread surrounding the scales, especially when people knew their weight was low. Not every plantation operated in exactly the same fashion, and historians still disagree over how standardized some quota systems really were across the Cotton South. But there is no doubt that measurement, comparison, and punishment were deeply woven into the labor of picking. The field during harvest has a different sound from chopping season. There is less impact and more friction. Hands rustle through leaves, sacks scrape. Cotton thumps softly as it drops inside. Voices travel in short bursts, often cut off quickly. Sometimes a baby cries from a shaded edge where an older child watches several little ones. Sometimes a driver calls for faster work. Sometimes there is only breathing and the dry chatter of insects. The air seems thinner somehow, though the heat is just as thick. You're not breaking ground now. You're stripping value from the plant as fast as your body will allow. And the body does allow astonishing things, though not without cost. Some experienced pickers developed a rhythm that seems almost impossible to outsiders. Fingers move quickly, shoulders lean just so, steps are measured, the sack shifts at the right moment. Skill matters. An experienced hand knows how to clear a bowl with fewer wasted motions. An experienced eye knows where the best cotton sits in the branch. This expertise was real, learned over seasons, and often overlooked in the lazy myth that field labour required nothing but brute force. It required endurance, yes, but also dexterity and memory. Planters depended on that skill while pretending it belonged naturally to the enslaved condition rather than to practiced human intelligence. A small, odd detail appears in some descriptions of picking time. Children or adults sometimes stuffed a little wad of cotton into the ear to soften wind or noise, or used it as a temporary pad on a sore spot caused by shoes or straps. Cotton, the source of the day's misery, could become a tiny comfort in another form. There is something almost wickedly ironic in that. The crop surrounds you, wounds you, enriches others, and still finds its way into the smallest acts of bodily improvisation. By late morning the sack becomes a creature of its own. It catches on stalks, it drags behind when the row narrows, it bumps your calves with every few steps. When you stoop too quickly, it swings and pulls your shoulder. When you stand too abruptly, your lower back complains at once. The constant half-bent posture has its own special genius for punishment. Your hamstrings tighten, your neck stiffens, a dull ache forms between the shoulders. Yet the raw head remains full, and as long as white shows on the stalk, the demand continues. The sun burns higher and the field turns brilliant. White cotton under hard light can almost hurt the eyes. Some workers tied cloth around the head not only for sweat but for shade. Others worked bareheaded when they had no choice. The smell is dry, dusty, and faintly green where leaves still cling to the stalk. Here and there a crushed bowl gives off a bitter plant scent. Sweat runs down the temples, and when it reaches the cuts on your fingers it stings sharply enough to make you hiss through your teeth. There is also the mental pressure of pace. Picking cotton punishes hesitation. If you pause to ease your back, you see at once how much row remains. If you stop to flex your fingers, the sack still waits to be filled. If you look up too often, someone may think you're not working hard enough. The day narrows. Your mind can begin to think only in handfuls and steps. A branch, another branch. 3 open bowls, move left, clear the lower stem, drag the sack. It is a dangerous kind of focus, useful for survival but shrinking the world until only labour remains. And yet people found ways to keep a wider world alive inside that narrowed one. Some counted quietly, not the quota itself, but songs, prayers, names, or imagined distances. Some whispered jokes. Some shaped the pace of their hands to an internal rhythm no overseer could hear. A person beside you might murmur something dry and perfect about the planter's fine coat, while everyone keeps eyes on the row. Laughter cannot fully bloom, but it glows for a second. That second matters. Gentle sarcasm, whispered under breath, becomes a small rebellion of the mind. Even in a cotton field, human beings remain annoyingly difficult to turn into machines. Punishment hovers over the work whether or not it appears every hour. That is the design. The possibility itself disciplines. On some plantations, poor weight could lead to whipping, especially during harvest when profits were immediate and visible. On others, punishments might include extra work, public humiliation, or restrictions that varied according to the owner's habits and temper. No version of this is humane, even where physical punishment was not inflicted at every low weight. The threat lived in the atmosphere like weather. Everyone knew it could break overhead. One of the grimmest features of picking season is how it extends the day. Cotton must be gathered when ready, and harvest could press from early light into dusk. In some places, people carried lanterns or worked into dim evening light when the crop was urgent and the weather favourable. Imagine how tired your hands must be by then. Imagine trying to distinguish white cotton in fading light, while your eyes blur and your shoulders burn. The field asks for the same motion after it has already taken the best strength of the day. There is something almost insulting about that expectation. The scale also creates opportunities for deceit from above. Weights can be manipulated, records can be bent, standards can be changed without warning. An enslaved person had very little power to challenge an owner's claim about what was owed or what had been produced. Historians continue to examine plantation books for evidence of how carefully weights were kept and how often figures served discipline as much as accounting. The surviving records look precise, but precision is not the same as fairness. A neat column of numbers can hide a tremendous amount of coercion. Children in picking season often faced a particularly cruel education. At first they might gather the lower, easier bowls or work beside an older relative. Soon enough they were expected to contribute in measurable ways. Little fingers could move quickly, and planters noticed that. Childhood becomes training in speed. That fact lands hard when you let it settle. A small body in the row is not there to watch the beauty of the white fields. It is there because profit has reached down to child height and found work to do. Still, the field never fully erases the senses. You feel the rough seam of the sack strap on your shoulder. You hear a mockingbird from the fence line, absurdly cheerful. You smell warm dust and old sweat drying in the cloth at your chest. A breeze arrives for 10 seconds and feels almost miraculous, then wanders off again. Tiny sensory mercies become strangely important. Shade from a passing cloud, cool water, if it comes, the brief relief of standing fully upright at the end of a row before bending again. By late afternoon, fatigue changes texture. Morning pain is sharp and newly insulting. Late day pain is heavier, duller, spread through the whole frame. The fingers do not stop hurting, but they belong to a general soreness that has moved into every part of you. Your thoughts become slower, the row seems longer, the sack becomes heavier more quickly. Some people moved through this hour on pure habit, others on pride, fear, stubbornness, or the desire not to hear their name called out. Endurance rarely comes from one source alone. So you keep picking hand to bowl, bowl to sack, sack to scale, because that is what the season demands from every person trapped in its reach. Cotton harvest in 1850 is not simply a busy agricultural period. It is a campaign of extraction, timed by ripening plants and enforced by surveillance as quota and threat. The white field that dazzles from afar becomes up close, a place of raw fingertips, bent backs, measured output, and exhausted concentration, and still the sacks fill. That is the terrible fact. The system works not because it is just, but because it compels human beings to keep feeding it with the labour of their own bodies. In the Cotton South, the field is never made up of one kind of person. It is a world of women, men, children, the elderly, pregnant women, nursing mothers, and people carrying old injuries that never healed properly. The plantation does not look at these differences with tenderness. It looks at them with calculation. What can this person do? How long can that one work? When can this child begin? Which woman can return to the row soonest? It is a terrible way to sort human life. Yet that sorting sits close to the centre of the cotton economy in 1850. You see very quickly that women are not sheltered from hard field labour. Popular myths once painted enslaved women as mainly domestic workers, drifting through kitchens and nurseries while men did the heaviest outdoor work. That picture was always incomplete, and in cotton regions it can be badly misleading. On many plantations, women worked in the fields beside men for long hours, planting, hoeing, picking, carrying, and enduring the same heat, supervision, and quota pressure. Some owners claimed women were more careful pickers. Others simply knew that every adult body available had to be worked. The field had no interest in protecting femininity as an ideal. Profit is rarely sentimental. Even so, labour was not always identical. Men might more often be assigned to the heaviest ploughing, ditching, timber cutting, or wagon work. especially where brute strength or draft animal handling was involved. Women might be given more of the repetitive hoeing and picking, though those tasks were hardly gentle. The differences varied by plantation size, local custom, crop cycle, and the owner's preferences. Historians still debate how consistent these gender divisions really were across the South, because records often reflect what owners imagined should happen, not always what actually did happen in a crisis, a labour shortage, or a demanding season. On the ground, practicality often overruled theory. Whoever could work, worked. For women, the burden often extended beyond the row itself. A woman might spend the day in the field and then return to cooking, mending, washing, childcare, or tending a small garden patch in the evening. That double load is one of the quiet brutalities of enslaved life. Labour does not end when the overseer turns away. It simply changes shape. By night, hands that have spent hours in cotton may be kneading meal, scrubbing garments, soothing a feverish child, or repairing a torn shirt by firelight. The plantation extracts daylight and still reaches into the dark. Pregnancy brought no reliable exemption from work. Some owners reduced labour late in pregnancy, at least for a time, especially if they viewed childbirth as an investment in future enslaved labourers. Others showed little patience. Formerly enslaved people later recalled women working deep into pregnancy, sometimes in the field until very near delivery. Nursing mothers could be granted moments to feed infants, but even that depended on local practice and the disposition of those in charge. Imagine the strain of carrying a child inside your body while bending, lifting, and moving under the sun. Imagine being expected to resume work quickly because a planter thinks the crop cannot wait. The cruelty is almost bureaucratic in its calmness. Children lived inside this structure from the beginning. A very small child might remain near the quarters with an older woman, an elder, or an older sibling. But childhood in the cotton South was short in practical terms. By 5, 6, or 7, many children were already being given regular responsibilities. They might gather wood, fetch water, carry food, mind babies, chase livestock away from gardens, or collect chips and kindling. As their bodies grew, the tasks grew too. Birds scaring in the fields, bringing drinking water to workers, cleaning yards, learning to card cotton, helping with livestock, then eventually joining in field labour more fully. A child learns fast in such a world, not because childhood has become noble or wise, but because necessity is a ruthless teacher. You can picture a small boy trying to keep up with older workers, his steps too quick to match their stride. You can picture a girl learning how to tie a headcloth, stir a pot, and keep an eye on a toddler while still young enough to want games. Play did exist. Laughter existed. Children made toys from scraps, rolled hoops, carved little figures, sang little songs, and chased one another whenever time loosened its grip for a moment. But play lived under interruption. At any time, labour could call. Teenagers often entered the most physically demanding part of plantation life just as their bodies were still changing. A 12 or 13-year-old might already be judged by work potential more than age. Some were nearly adult in the eyes of the field long before they were ready in any humane sense. Height, strength, and stamina mattered more than birthdays. This blurred line between child and adult was useful to the plantation because it expanded the labour pool. It was devastating to families because it exposed young people to adult burdens early, while still leaving them vulnerable to separation, punishment, and fear. Men in the field carried their own expectations. They were often pushed toward the heaviest visible labour and judged against ideals of strength and endurance. A man who could plough well, manage mules, cut timber, repair a fence, or carry large loads might be treated as especially valuable property, which was not a compliment anyone should ever want. It meant harder demands and often greater exposure to punishment if output disappointed. Some men also served as drivers, a role that could bring slight material advantage or reduced physical labour in certain moments, but at a severe moral and emotional cost. To be forced into supervising others while sharing their condition was one of slavery's crueler manipulations, age-altered work, though not always mercifully. Elderly people might be given lighter assignments if they could no longer keep pace in the main gang. They could care for children, spin, mend, shell corn, watch the yard, or perform other tasks considered less strenuous. Yet lighter did not necessarily mean easy. An old back still aches over a washpot. Old eyes still strain by dim firelight. Old hands still stiffen in cold weather. The plantation rarely rewarded long service with comfort. It simply adjusted the work to what remained useful. You also notice how families move through labour together without ever truly being left in peace. A mother keeps half an ear on where her child has gone. An older brother watches his sister in the row without seeming to look. A grandmother notices who has not eaten enough. A father tries to repair a shoe at night after a day in the field because the child wearing it cannot afford another blister tomorrow. These forms of care do not erase the violence around them. They persist within it. That persistence is one of the strongest threads in the story. There is a quirky little detail in some accounts from enslaved communities that makes the domestic world feel very close. Children sometimes made dolls from corn husks, rags, or carved roots, and adults could fashion tiny whistles, rolling toys, or improvised instruments from whatever material was available. Such objects were fragile and easy to lose, yet they reveal a great deal. Even in places built around extraction, people still created beauty, comfort, and amusement on a miniature scale. Human beings keep doing that. It must have been deeply irritating to the institution of slavery. The emotional burden on parents was constant. You would not only worry whether a child was fed, clothed, and healthy enough to endure the work expected, you would also worry whether the child might be sold. Family separation was a permanent threat in the enslaved South. Not every plantation sale tore apart a household, but the possibility hung over daily life. A child's usefulness could increase market value. A young woman of childbearing age could be valued in brutal reproductive terms. A skilled man could be sold to settle debts or shift labour. In such a system, even love had to coexist with fear, and yet family bonds often remained remarkably strong. Marriages were not legally protected for enslaved people, but couples formed enduring unions, raised children, shared labour, and built kin networks that extended beyond blood. Fictive kin, trusted elders called aunt or uncle, neighbours who stood in as guardians, older children who became almost second parents. All of this helped hold communities together. The plantation counted bodies. The people themselves built relationship. That distinction matters. The work of women especially reveals how slavery tried to claim both productive and reproductive labour at once. A woman's capacity to pick cotton, cook food, mend garments, bear children, and care for others could all be exploited within the same system. This made her central to plantation survival in more ways than one. Yet owners often failed to understand, or refused to admit, how much depended on women's skill, endurance, and emotional labour. Records may list them as hands, breeders, servants, or numbers in an inventory, but such cold labels hide the enormous range of work they actually carried. There were also tensions within households, because exhaustion leaves little room for gentleness. A man worn down by field labour might become withdrawn. A mother carrying too many duties might have no patience left at dusk. A child pressed into work could resent an older sibling's authority. Historians who study enslaved family life are careful not to romanticize it. Love was real, but so was strain, grief, jealousy, and conflict. Bondage did not transform every cabin into a saintly refuge. It made ordinary family struggles harder by placing them inside extraordinary oppression. At the same time, gender could shape acts of protection. Women shared birthing knowledge, herbal remedies, childcare, and practical wisdom about food stretching and garment repair. Men shared knowledge about tools, animals, roots, and negotiation with overseers. Such divisions were never perfect, but they mattered. Knowledge moved through households quietly, often without entering the written record. That is one reason scholars remain cautious. The archive preserves what power noticed. It often misses what communities taught themselves in low voices. As the day in the field wears on, these social differences remain visible even when everyone is bent over the same crop. A child's shorter reach, a pregnant woman's altered stance, an older man's slower turn at the end of the row, a nursing mother glancing toward where an infant has been left in the shade. The plantation sees labour categories. You see human situations, One view is administrative, the other is real. By evening, the unequal layering of work becomes clearer still. The men do not all return to rest. There may be wood to split, animals to tend, fences to mend. The women do not all sit down. There are fires to build, food to prepare, children to wash, torn garments to stitch, hair to comb, feet to check for thorns or sores. Children are still carrying errands, dozing in corners, or being pulled close for comfort after a day that demanded too much from them. Every part of the household is involved in the labour system, whether in the row itself or in the work needed to make another day possible. So when you ask how black Americans kept working on cotton fields in 1851, answer lays in this family labour world, grim and intimate at the same time. The plantation did not rely on isolated workers, it relied on entire households under pressure. Women, men, and children were all drawn into its machinery in different ways, each carrying burdens shaped by age, body, gender, and expectation. The cotton field was never just a place of individual exertion. It was a social order built to consume whole lives, while those lives still tried, stubbornly and skillfully, to care for one another inside it. By the time you leave the field, the plantation has already taken most of your strength, but it is not finished with you yet. Survival depends on a second world of labour that begins when the rows are behind you. Food must be found, stretched, cooked, and shared. Clothing must be patched until the cloth nearly gives up. Shelter must be maintained even when the walls lean. The roof lets in rain, and the floor feels more like packed earth than comfort. None of this is decorative background. It is the practical foundation that keeps people alive long enough to be sent out again. You return to the quarters with dust on your ankles, burrs in your hem, and the dull ache of a body that would rather lie down at once. The cabins stand close enough for voices to travel between them, though not always close enough for privacy to feel real. Many are built of rough logs or simple wooden planks, chinked with clay, mud, moss, or scraps of whatever could block the wind. Some have stick and mud chimneys, some have floors of split boards, others are little more than hard dirt underfoot. The smell inside is a mixture of smoke, damp wood, old cloth, ashes, and the day's sweat drying on tired bodies. In wet weather, everything carries a sour softness. In dry weather, dust settles into the cracks. Housing for enslaved people varied by region and plantation wealth. But generous housing is one of those planter myths that collapses when you look closely. Even where a cabin appeared solid from outside, it could still be crowded, smoky, cold in winter, stifling in summer, and vulnerable to insects, rot, or leaking rain. A door that closes is not the same thing as security. A roof overhead is not the same thing as comfort. The planter's records may mention quarters as if they were simply another estate feature, almost like a barn with feelings. You, standing inside, know better. The cabin is often a single room, or at most divided in a rough way, which means daily life happens in tight company. Sleeping, eating, mending, nursing, grieving, laughing, all of it gathers in the same space. Firelight shifts across faces and walls. Shadows enlarge ordinary motions until someone stirring a pot looks almost theatrical. A child dozes with head against an elder's knee. Another scratches at a mosquito bite and gets told to stop before it bleeds. Somewhere nearby a baby fusses, and the sound carries through thin walls with no respect for household boundaries. Food is the first urgent matter. Plantation rations often centered on cornmeal and pork, sometimes with molasses, flour, or seasonal additions. Though amounts and quality varied, some plantations issued weekly rations, others monthly. Saltfish might appear in certain places. Sweet potatoes, peas, greens, or pumpkins could supplement the diet when available. But the ration system was rarely generous enough to produce ease. It was calibrated for maintenance, not pleasure. Enough to keep labour going was the goal. The rest had to come from skill. That skill was immense. You take plain cornmeal and turn it into ash cake, hoe cake, mush, or pone. You make a little pork flavour a larger pot than it has any right to support. You boil greens with pepper if you have pepper. You stretch broth with onions, field peas, or bits of whatever can be gathered. Enslaved people often kept gardens when permitted, raising collards, beans, squash, sweet potatoes, and herbs in small plots near the quarters. Chickens might be kept. Fishing, trapping, and hunting sometimes helped too, though access depended on local rules, landscape, and the willingness of an owner to tolerate such efforts. A rabbit in the pot could transform a week. There is scholarly debate over how much independent food production actually sustained enslaved communities from plantation to plantation. Some historians emphasize the significance of gardens and hunting. Others warn that planter restrictions, poor land, limited time, and theft by animals or people could sharply reduce what these efforts produced. Both points can be true. A garden might be essential and still not be enough. What matters is that people kept trying, which tells you everything about the insufficiency of what they were given. The smell of evening cooking in the quarters must have been powerful. Smoke and cornmeal, pork fat hitting an iron pot, greens softening in a steam, wood ash, damp kindling, and the faint sweetness of roasting sweet potatoes. A smell like that does more than fill the air. It announces that someone, somehow, has made a meal out of scarcity again. Hunger sharpens the senses. Even a thin supper can feel like a victory when your stomach has been emptying itself all day. Meals also reveal the social intelligence of the household. Who gets the larger portion? Who needs soft food because of toothaches? Who has worked in the field longest today? Which child can be trusted to carry a bowl without spilling? Which elder should be served first out of respect? Plantation records may count meat by pound and meal by bushel, but they do not capture this domestic choreography, the quiet moral decisions happening over every pot. Clothing tells another story of forced thrift. Plantation issue garments were commonly coarse and few. Men might receive shirts, trousers, jackets, and perhaps a hat or shoes in limited quantities. Women might receive dresses, petticoats, headcloths, or aprons. Children often got less, especially when small. The fabric was cheap, rough, and expected to last far longer than reasonable. In winter, cold could move right through it. In summer, it trapped heat and rubbed sweat into the skin. A shoe was precious, but shoes wore out quickly in field conditions. Going barefoot was common for children and not unusual for adults, especially in warm months or when footwear failed. So the evening brings more work. A sleeve torn on a cotton stalk must be patched. A hem frayed by field dust must be turned and stitched again. A shirt too large for one child may be altered for another. Needles become treasured objects. Thread matters. A scrap of cloth saved from an old garment becomes a patch, a tie, a head wrap, or a rag for bandaging a blistered foot. Enslaved women were often expected to sew for their families and sometimes for plantation use as well, but men also repaired garments, especially when necessity left no room for tidy gender ideas. Poverty is wonderfully efficient at mocking social theory. One small and rather lovely detail from various accounts is the care given to head wraps and hair despite hardship. A strip of cloth, folded and tied with skill, could hold hair back from the face, absorb sweat, and still carry a sense of personal style. Hair itself might be braided, twisted, or wrapped according to practical need, local custom, and individual preference. In a world bent on reducing people to labouring bodies, the act of arranging your appearance could become a quiet statement that you remained a self, not just a unit of work. Shelter, meanwhile, was never passive. Cabins had to be maintained from within because owners did not always provide timely repairs, or any repairs worth the name. Cracks needed filling before cold weather. Roof leaks had to be managed with pans, cloth, or desperate optimism. Chimneys smoked badly. Doors hung crooked. Vermin found their way into corners, bedding, and food stores. Fleas, lice, mosquitoes, and bedbugs were not abstract inconveniences. They were part of the texture of life. Sleep in such a room was often a negotiation between fatigue and irritation. Touch becomes especially vivid here. Your hand on a rough door latch, the splintered edge of a stool, the scratch of a straw pallet under a thin blanket, the soft warmth of a child finally asleep against your shoulder. The welcome heat of a fire on shins still dusty from the field. Comfort, when it appears, is specific and local. Not luxury, just relief enough to keep going. Some cabins contained very little furniture. Perhaps a table, a few stools, crude bedsteads if fortunate, storage boxes, gourds, iron pots, wooden trenchers, maybe a skillet. Yet even sparse interiors could hold signs of care. A shelf arranged with bowls, herbs hanging to dry, a broom set by the wall, a Bible if someone had one, though literacy among enslaved people was often suppressed by law and violence. A polished spoon kept safe, a handmade quilt, pieced from scraps, spreading colour across a room that otherwise offered little softness. Objects do not need to be expensive to be intimate. Water was another constant concern. It had to be fetched, carried, heated, and guarded from waste. Washing clothing after field labour was a punishing task in itself. Rubbing coarse cloth against itself in tubs or at streams, wringing, lifting, hanging, all of it worked the arms that were already tired. Personal washing might be limited by time, season, and access. But people still sought cleanliness where possible, for comfort, dignity, health, and simple human preference. Clean skin after a dirty day feels almost miraculous, even if the miracle is only partial. Owners often described rationing and housing as evidence of paternal care, which is one of history's more shameless performances. To boast that you feed and house the people you enslave is rather like congratulating yourself for watering a mule you overwork. The comparison is ugly, but the paternal language was uglier because it tried to make domination sound benevolent. Enslaved people understood perfectly well that the cabins, rations, and yearly cloth allotments were not gifts. They were operating costs in a profitable system. Even within that system, barter and informal exchange could soften the edges a little. On some plantations, enslaved people sold chickens, eggs, vegetables, baskets, or handmade goods in local markets or to neighbours, sometimes with permission, sometimes in tolerated grey areas. The extra coins could buy tobacco, cloth, needles, ribbons, food, or other small items that made life less bare. Historians still argue over how much autonomy these exchanges created. Some see them as meaningful spaces of initiative. Others caution that they remained tightly constrained and could disappear whenever an owner wished. Again, both truths may sit together. A narrow opening is still not freedom. Night in the quarters carries a different atmosphere from the field. The sounds are softer, but not restful in any simple way. Pots scrape. Fire pops. Someone coughs deep and hard from dust in the lungs. Quiet conversation drifts through the dark. A child whimpers in sleep. Footsteps pass outside. The room grows hotter near the hearth, colder near the walls. Smoke stings your eyes if the chimney draws badly. You taste salt on your upper lip long after the day's sweat has dried. This domestic labour is essential to the cotton economy, even though it often goes uncounted. Fields do not run on force alone. They run on meals prepared from little, clothes coaxed through one more season, children kept alive, elders tended, blisters wrapped, coughs soothed, cabins repaired, and tools found at dawn when needed. The quarters are not outside the system. They are one of the places that make the system possible. So when you enter the evening world of food, clothing, and shelter, you're not stepping away from labour. You are entering another layer of it, one usually carried out with less recognition and just as much necessity. The cabins may be cramped, the food plain, the garments worn, and the roof unreliable. Yet within those limits, people practiced a daily art of survival. They cooked, patched, arranged, saved, improvised, and cared. The plantation provided too little, and still expected life to continue. Somehow, against that mean expectation, life did continue. Mourning in the cotton South is not only about work, it is also about being watched. By the time the sun has cleared the trees, you can feel a tension settling across the field like a second kind of weather. Some days it is near and obvious. A man on horseback moving along the rows, boots creaking in the stirrups, eyes scanning every bend of the back and every pause of the hand. Other days it is farther off, less visible but still present. carried through drivers, rules, rumours, and the memory of what happens when someone in power decides the pace is not good enough. The plantation does not need constant shouting to make itself felt. It has already taught your body to expect scrutiny. The overseer stands at the centre of that scrutiny on many plantations. He is the man hired to make the owner's will visible in daily life, and that job rarely encourages tenderness. His work is to measure labour, assign tasks, monitor output, report problems, and enforce discipline. On large properties, he can seem almost like a moving part of the plantation itself, always appearing where fatigue begins to show, his horse, his hat, his cane or whip. Even the way he sits and watches all become part of the emotional architecture of the day. You do not have to speak to him for him to alter the air around you, yet plantation control was never carried by one figure alone. Many owners were absent for parts of the year, leaving management to overseers. Some owners were present and intervened constantly. Some plantations used enslaved drivers to keep gangs moving and report on work. Some relied on white family members, adult sons, or trusted subordinates. Local habits differed. Historians still debate how sharply the overseer's role varied by region and plantation size, especially as the domestic slave trade expanded and new cotton lands developed. But the pattern is clear enough. Surveillance was layered. If one set of eyes was not on you, another might be. That constant watchfulness shaped behaviour in tiny ways. You learn not to stand fully upright for long. You learn how to speak without seeming to stop work. You learn how to keep your hands moving while your mind slips somewhere else for a few moments. Even the angle of your shoulders can become strategic. Too slow and you draw notice. Too quick in the wrong way and you look clumsy, wasteful, or suspicious. Under slavery, ordinary posture becomes political without anyone asking your permission. The overseer's shadow also reaches beyond the field. He may inspect cabins, ration distributions, livestock, tools, and paths between quarters and work sites. He may decide who is sick enough to be excused and who is merely accused of pretending. He may interpret a late arrival as laziness, insolence, illness, sabotage, or simple accident, depending on his mood and interest. This power over interpretation is one of the ugliest parts of the system. The enslaved person's own explanation counts for very little against the convenience of a man whose job depends on finding labour discipline wherever he looks. And then there is punishment, hanging in the air whether or not it arrives that day. Punishment could be physical, including whipping, beating, shackling, or confinement. It could also be social or material, such as reduced privileges, denial of passes, interruption of visits, extra work assignments, public humiliation, or threats of sale. The exact form varied, and planters often liked to pretend they used moderation, as though mild cruelty deserved applause. Formerly enslaved people remembered otherwise. Pain, fear, and uncertainty were built into the structure. The point was not simply to hurt. The point was to make future obedience more likely. You notice how punishment often begins before any blow is struck. It starts in the raised voice, the pause behind your shoulder, the horse stopping at the end of the row, the announcement that weights will be checked, the question asked in a tone that already contains its answer. Anticipation does a great deal of the work. Fear is efficient, which is one reason slaveholders loved it so much. It can move through a field faster than a person on foot. Still, the overseer's power was never as complete as the plantation wanted it to be. Control had to be repeated precisely because it was always at risk of fraying. People negotiated, delayed, feigned confusion, stretched a task, pleaded illness, worked carefully instead of quickly, or used forms of politeness that sounded obedient while preserving a sliver of self-command. This is not a romantic story of cleverness always winning. Very often it did not. But the need for endless supervision tells you something important. Enslaved people were not passive matter. They had wills, judgments, loyalties, and limits, and the plantation had to keep pressing on those things to maintain itself. Drivers occupied an especially complicated place in this world. An enslaved driver might carry a whip, report poor performance, and relay orders. While still being vulnerable to the same owner's violence and sale as everyone else, some drivers were feared, some were hated, some tried to soften demands where they could, protecting others quietly or absorbing blame when possible. Others enforced discipline harshly, whether out of ambition, fear, coercion, or all three at once. Scholars are careful here, because the role varied enormously, and the moral judgments can become too neat from a distance. What matters is that slavery loved divided loyalties. It made hierarchy out of captivity itself. A curious detail from several plantation descriptions is the use of horns, bells, and even watches as symbols of command. The horn calling workers in before dawn was not merely practical. It announced that time itself belonged to somebody else. A bell could order bodies to move across space as neatly as livestock. A pocket watch in a planter's hand became a little machine of ownership, ticking away hours no enslaved person was free to arrange. There is something almost theatrical about it. Rather pathetic, really. A grown man relying on a bell to prove he controls another man's morning. Yet the theatre had teeth. Because surveillance was constant, trust became a delicate matter. Who can hear what you say? Who repeats what? Who has been pressured into informing? Who can safely carry a message to a spouse on another plantation or to a relative in a distant quarter? Enslaved communities built networks of trust with remarkable care, but they had to do so under conditions designed to make secrecy dangerous. The field could be full of people and still feel lonely if you did not know who was safe. This pressure shaped language too. A direct answer might be dangerous. A vague answer might also be dangerous. So people developed tones, gestures, and codes that let meaning travel without fully exposing it. Deference could be sincere, strategic, or both at once. Silence could mean obedience, anger, caution, or simple exhaustion. Historians examining testimony often note how hard it is to reconstruct intention from the written record, because enslaved people had to speak within systems of danger. What sounds submissive on paper may have carried a different charge in the moment. That uncertainty matters. It reminds you that domination distorts the archive as well as the body. The field itself becomes part of surveillance. Long, straight rows make movement visible. Open space limits concealment. Distances between workers can be adjusted for control. Even the wagon road can function like a viewing line from which progress is judged. Plantation design was never neutral. It organized land so labor could be watched, extracted, and moved efficiently. You feel that in your spine when you glance up and realize there is almost nowhere to disappear. Illness complicates everything. A fever, an injured hand, a swollen ankle, a hard cough. These do not arrive politely after harvest. They arrive when they please. Yet to be sick under surveillance is to enter a negotiation you may not win. Some owners used doctors, at least when valuable labor was threatened. Others relied on home remedies or simple neglect. Many enslaved people drew on their own medical knowledge, herbs, roots, poultices, and practical care learned within the community. But even when suffering was obvious, the final authority on whether you worked often belonged to someone more interested in output than healing. Few situations reveal the coldness of the system more clearly than a sick person being treated as a disputed expense. Women faced particular exposure under surveillance. Pregnancy could be monitored for labor value. Nursing could be timed and regulated. Domestic work in white households brought women under yet another set of eyes, often invasive and predatory. Men, too, lived under sexualized power and bodily vulnerability, though the forms differed. The plantation saw bodies as usable in multiple ways, and oversight moved accordingly. The field overseer was only one part of a broader regime that reached into reproduction, family formation, movement, and intimate life. Yet even here, people carved out hidden spaces, not large spaces, not safe spaces, just narrow ones. A few exchanged words while hauling water. A warning passed from one row to another. A signal in a song. A meeting arranged after dark. A complaint disguised as a joke. A pause near the tree line long enough to steady your breathing. These moments did not overthrow the system, but they kept inner life from being fully absorbed by it. Sometimes survival is simply the refusal to let power narrate every thought. The overseer's shadow also affected how people imagined him. He could become larger in memory than in physical fact, not because the memory was false, but because authority expands in the mind when backed by punishment. A glance from horseback can linger all day, The crack of a whip used on someone else can enter your sleep. The plantation understood spectacle, public punishment, public weighing, public rebuke. These were not accidents. They were performances intended to turn one person's pain into another person's caution, and yet authority could look ridiculous in motion. An overseer trying to prove importance by barking at people who already know how to do the work. A planter fussing over numbers in a ledger while unable to pick a decent row himself. The whole arrangement depends on a strange vanity, the fantasy that command creates production all by itself. In truth, the system relies on knowledge and endurance located in the very people it denies authority to. That contradiction is worth holding on to. It does not cancel the violence. It exposes the insecurity beneath it. As daylight stretches and supervision continues, you feel how the plantation tries to turn fear into routine. Watch the row, keep pace, answer carefully, lower your eyes at the right moment, carry the pass if one is required, be visible when expected, invisible when not. This choreography of caution is exhausting in its own right. Labour under slavery is never just physical effort. It is also mental vigilance, the constant management of expression, timing, and tone in the presence of people who can punish almost any misstep. So the overseer's shadow falls not only across the cotton plants, but across speech, posture, illness, trust, and the smallest rhythms of daily life. Surveillance in 1850 was not a side feature of the cotton regime. It was one of its principal tools. The field demanded work, but the watching demanded something else as well. It demanded that people carry fear in a usable form, enough to keep the row moving, enough to make resistance costly, enough to let power feel secure for another day. And still, beneath that shadow, human judgment continued quietly, measuring the watcher right back. By this point, the body has become the true battlefield of cotton labour, not in the grand, heroic sense that speeches like to borrow, but in the plain and daily sense of skin, muscle, lungs, joints, stomach, and sleep. Every task in the cotton world asks something physical of you, and most tasks ask too much. The field does not merely occupy your time, it enters the body and stays there. Heat stays there, dust stays there, pain stays there. Even rest, when it comes, often feels like a brief negotiation with soreness rather than a real escape from it. The first thing you notice is how quickly discomfort becomes ordinary. A blister on the palm, a split at the fingertip, a sore place on the shoulder where the sack rubs, an ache in the lower back after bending over rows. At first, each sensation arrives with its own distinct insult. Later, they blur into a general condition of being alive in the field. That is one of slavery's quieter cruelties. It teaches the body to accept too much as normal, because normal has no authority here. The plantation sets the standard, and the standard is whatever amount of pain still allows work tomorrow. Heat shapes everything. On a cotton plantation in the south, summer can feel thick enough to lean against. By late morning, the air presses down on the head and shoulders. Sweat begins early and rarely stops. It runs behind the knees, down the spine, into the waistband and along the temples until salt reaches your lips. Clothes cling, then dry stiff, then cling again. The top of your head bakes in the sun if uncovered, and even with a hat or cloth wrap, the heat gathers under it like trapped breath. Shade becomes precious, not because it solves anything, but because it interrupts the assault for a minute. The body responds in predictable ways. You become thirsty long before there is time to drink deeply. Your mouth goes dry even while sweat pours from you. Legs feel heavy. The pulse in the neck seems louder. Some people grow dizzy. Others develop headaches that throb behind the eyes while they keep working because stopping is more dangerous than continuing. Heat exhaustion is not an abstract risk. It is a real presence in the row, especially during long picking days and chopping seasons when movement never quite ends. Still, the work goes on because the crop is not arranged around your well-being. Then there are the hands. Those poor overworked diplomats between body and field. Cotton tears at them. Hose harden them. Rope burns them. Splinters visit them. Handles rub them until calluses form, crack, and form again. Fingernails break or go black from repeated strain. Little cuts open and fill with dust. Sometimes they sting sharply when sweat enters them. Other times they go dull and numb, which may be worse because numbness tempts you to think the damage has passed. It has not passed. It has simply settled in. Feet suffer their own campaign, whether in poor shoes, in worn shoes, or no shoes. Feet carry the whole arrangement. They sink in wet ground, burn on dry paths, and collect thorns, blisters, bruises, and insect bites. A stone in a shoe can become a misery if there is no chance to stop and shake it out. Bare soles toughen, yes, but toughness is not immunity. Hard ground jars the bones. Mud sucks at the ankles. Damp feet invite cracking and infection. A person who cannot walk well cannot keep pace. And in the plantation world, that physical fact becomes a social danger at once. Cotton work also punishes the back with impressive consistency. Bending at the waist to pick, stooping to weed, lifting sacks, carrying loads, twisting to empty baskets, sleeping on poor bedding afterward. The lower back becomes a place where labour collects. You feel it when rising from a squat, when turning suddenly, when lifting a child in the evening, when coughing, when trying to lie down. Older workers must have known this ache like an unwanted relative, always nearby and somehow more talkative in damp weather. Dust enters the story everywhere. It rises from dry paths, it clings to clothing, it settles on food if pots are not covered, it gets into eyes, nostrils, and throat. During parts of the season, lint and plant debris float in the air as well. You breathe all of it. By evening, the inside of your mouth can feel coated. A cough follows. Some coughs are brief, just the body's way of objecting. Others linger for weeks, deep and rough. Lung irritation, colds, fevers, and chest complaints could all be worsened by crowded cabins, smoke from indoor fires, poor nutrition, and relentless outdoor labour. Sickness does not arrive neatly one at a time. Conditions pile on each other. The stomach tells its own story. Hard labour demands calories, water, and rest. Enslaved people often receive too little of at least two of those, and sometimes all three. Hunger can feel sharp, but it can also become strangely flat, a drained weakness that sits behind the ribs and makes the body slow. Working on a limited diet leaves you more vulnerable to illness and slower to recover from injury. A body short on nourishment mends reluctantly, cuts close slowly. Bruises linger. A fever empties you faster. There is nothing mysterious about it. The body keeps score, even when the ledger belongs to someone else. Women carried physical burdens shaped by their own bodies as well. Menstruation did not pause field labour. Pregnancy did not reliably pause it either. A woman might be working while nauseated, cramping, dizzy, or carrying a child inside her through heat and strain. After childbirth, recovery could be far too short before labour resumed. Nursing mothers faced another level of bodily demand, feeding infants while also being expected to keep up with work. The cotton regime had a talent for assuming the body would simply adapt forever. Bodies, being less obedient than planters, often answered with exhaustion, injury, or loss. Children's bodies were vulnerable in different ways. They tired faster, grew out of clothes and shoes quickly, and lacked the strength of adults while still being pushed into useful labour. A child's sunburned neck, scraped knees, swollen feet, or hungry restlessness might not look dramatic on paper, but it marks the ordinary damage of being made useful too soon. Growing bones and muscles need care. The plantation preferred output. Medical care, when it existed, was uneven and often inadequate. Some plantations summoned physicians, particularly for illnesses that threatened a large part of the labour force or endangered valuable pregnant women and children in the eyes of owners. But physicians in this period could do little for many conditions, and their presence did not guarantee compassion. Enslaved people also relied heavily on community knowledge, herbal remedies, poultices, steam, teas, roots, and careful nursing from family members and neighbours. This practical medicine mattered enormously. A wash for a wound, a tea for fever, a poultice for swelling. These could make the difference between returning slowly to work and collapsing entirely. Scholars still argue over how much authority enslaved healers retained under different plantation regimes, but there is no doubt they were essential. A curious little physical detail appears in scattered recollections from the south. Some workers rubbed fat, grease, or tallow on hands and feet when possible, trying to soften cracks or protect skin against rubbing. It was hardly a perfect remedy, and sometimes there was too little to spare, but the gesture reveals a great deal. In a world that treated your body as an instrument of profit, you still tried to care for it in whatever small ways remained available. Grease on a split hand, cloth around a swollen ankle, a cool rag across a forehead. These are humble acts, but they belong to the history as surely as the field does. Sleep should be the body's repair shop. In the quarters, it was often more like a crowded waiting room. Too little space, too much noise, smoke in the air, insects in bedding, a baby crying, someone coughing, rain on a leaky roof, cold working through poor blankets in winter, heat trapped in still air during summer, and over all of it, the knowledge that dawn would come soon. Even when fatigue knocked you down fast, deep rest was not guaranteed. You might wake with the same ache you carried to bed, only stiffer now, as if the night had been thinking mean thoughts. Scars belong to many bodies in this world. Some came from punishment, some from accidents with tools, animals, wagons, or sharp plants, some from childhood illnesses, burns, and falls. The field did not care what old injury you carried. It simply asked whether the body could still be made useful. A healed break may set badly. A shoulder once strained may never move easily again. An eye irritated by dust may remain weak. These old damages shape labour, even if no ledger bothers to note them. There is also the strange bodily knowledge that develops under repeated strain. You learn how to shift weight to protect one hip. You learn which hand can take the heavier pull today. You learn to save one burst of strength for lifting at the scale. You learn the exact moment when standing up straight will help, and the exact moment when it wastes time. This is not the kind of expertise polite society likes to admire, because to admire it, honestly, would require admitting the conditions that produced it. Yet it is expertise all the same, written in muscle memory and hard experience. Pain also affects mood, though people living through it do not always have the luxury of naming that clearly. A tired body can become irritable, withdrawn, or numb. Patience thins. Small problems grow sharp edges. A crying child at night may break your heart and your last nerve at the same time. A badly fitting shoe may ruin your whole afternoon. A cramped hand may make you dread the next row before the day has properly begun. Historians who study enslaved life are careful not to flatten endurance into saintly calm. People under chronic pain still argued, sighed, snapped, joked bitterly, yes, and carried on. Endurance was human, not polished. And yet there were moments of bodily relief that must have felt almost sacred. Cool water on the face, shoes removed at dusk, a breeze across sweat-damp skin, sitting on a cabin step after standing all day, stretching fingers near the fire in cold weather, a child's light hand on your shoulder, the smell of herbs crushed into a wash basin, warm food reaching an empty stomach. Such moments were small, yes, but the body notices small mercies with unusual intensity when life offers so few. By evening, the field has usually extracted all the easy strength. What remains is stubborn strength, reluctant strength, the kind that gets one more pot lifted, one more shirt mended, one more child settled. That continuation is not proof that the body is fine. It is proof that necessity is relentless. Cotton labour in 1850 depended on bodies being worn down and used again anyway. Heat, dust, hunger, soreness, cuts, coughs, swelling, poor sleep, old injuries, and insufficient care all belong to the ordinary experience of keeping the crop moving. The astonishing part is not that the work hurt. Of course it hurt. The astonishing part is how many people kept standing, bending, lifting, and breathing through that hurt for one more day. Not every act of resistance in the Cotton South looked dramatic. There were no trumpets for it, no grand banners flapping over the rows, no tidy speech announcing that rebellion had officially begun at 9 a.m, just after a miserable breakfast. Most resistance lived in smaller spaces, inside timing, tone, memory, movement, and the tiny decisions a person could still make while trapped inside a brutal system. This matters because the plantation preferred a comforting fantasy about itself. It liked to imagine that force had settled everything. It had not. Beneath the surface of obedience, enslaved people kept pushing back in ways large and small, practical and symbolic, visible and hidden. You begin with the simplest form of resistance, the refusal to give the plantation every drop of energy it wanted. In the field, that could mean slowing the pace just slightly, especially when no one powerful stood close enough to read the difference. It could mean working carefully rather than quickly, taking just a little longer at the end of a row, letting your body recover for a few extra breaths while your hands still appeared busy. Under slavery, time itself became contested ground. A stolen minute was not freedom, but it was still stolen from the people who claimed to own the day. Sometimes resistance hid inside the body. Illness could be real and still doubted. Fatigue could be crushing and still interpreted as laziness. In that cruel space between suffering and accusation, some people exaggerated weakness to avoid the worst work or to gain a few hours outside the field. Others used an injury, a limp, a cough, or a swollen hand to slow expectations when they could. This was risky. If the deception failed, punishment could follow. Yet the very fact that such strategies existed tells you how desperate the labour regime was to command every possible effort. People looked for seams in the system, because the system left them so few humane alternatives. Tools offered another opportunity. A hoe handle might break, a basket might go missing, a harness strap might tear at an inconvenient moment, a gate might not latch correctly, a mule might seem harder to manage than usual. Not every accident was sabotage and, of course, tools in hard agricultural environments break constantly. Leather wears out, wood splits, animals behave like animals. Historians are careful here because evidence is often indirect. Still, plantation records and recollections contain enough complaints about breakage, carelessness, and lost equipment to suggest that some damage was no accident at all. When people had little power over the system's objects became tempting targets. Fire was feared everywhere in plantation country, and with good reason. Cotton, wood buildings, fodder stacks, and dry weather made the landscape vulnerable. Deliberate arson did occur in some times and places, though it carried enormous danger and could invite savage retaliation. Because the consequences were so serious, many enslaved people likely avoided it unless desperation or collective plans pushed them there. The mere fear of fire, however, reveals something important. Slaveholders knew that their wealth depended on fragile materials and resentful labourers. For all their bluster, they understood how exposed they really were. There was also resistance through theft, though that word deserves some suspicion here. If a person takes food from a system that has stolen their labour, family security, and bodily autonomy, calling it theft begins to sound morally confused. Enslaved people took extra food, livestock, cloth, tools, tobacco, liquor, and other goods when possible. Some shared these items within the quarters, some traded them, some simply used them to live a little better than the ration system allowed. Owners complained bitterly about pilfering, as if exploitation should at least have been conducted with excellent manners. Their complaints tell you how common the problem could be. You can picture the practical intelligence involved. A few ears of corn hidden under brush, a piece of salt pork trimmed quietly from a larger cut, eggs gathered before someone counts them, a fish caught at dusk, greens taken from the edge of a garden, a scrap of cloth saved from plantation stores. These acts required judgment about who might notice, when, and how much could disappear without causing a search. Small-scale resistance often depended less on bravery than on observation. You watched patterns, you studied habits, you learned who counted carefully and who merely liked to threaten. Speech itself could resist. A joke whispered in the field, a nickname for an overseer too absurd to speak aloud near him, a story told at night that transformed a powerful white man into a fool, a greedy beast, or a creature outwitted by someone smaller and sharper. Folklore mattered here. Trickster tales, especially those involving Brer Rabbit and similar figures in later traditions, carried more than entertainment. They offered a language for admiring cleverness under pressure. They let listeners imagine a weak figure surviving by intelligence rather than force. Whether every tale was directly political in the moment is something scholars still debate, but the pattern is hard to miss. People denied formal power often become excellent students of wit. Singing could also hold layered meaning. A work song might set rhythm and ease the monotony. A spiritual might express sorrow, hope, warning, or coded longing. Not every song was a secret message. Sometimes a song was just a song, and that should be respected too. Yet music created a shared space the overseer could hear without fully possessing. Tone, emphasis, and context could carry meanings beyond the literal words. Community often lives in those extra meanings, the ones not easily captured by outsiders writing things down later. One particularly quiet form of resistance was the preservation of self-presentation. That may sound too gentle to count, but think about the plantation's goal. It wanted labouring bodies, not full persons. So keeping a head wrap neat, braiding a child's hair carefully, maintaining a courtship, choosing a song, naming a baby with intention, protecting a family recipe, or observing a spiritual practice became more than routine. These acts did not topple the system, but they denied its deepest fantasy, the fantasy that domination could define the whole person. Human beings are annoyingly persistent in this way. Running away was the most direct form of refusal, though also one of the most perilous. Some escapes were brief, with people hiding in woods or swamps for a few days to avoid punishment or forced negotiation. Historians often call this marooning in short-term form, though the term is also used for longer-lasting fugitive communities. Other escapes aimed at permanent freedom, whether towards cities, free states, Spanish-speaking borderlands in earlier decades, or simply a life beyond a specific owner. In the Deep South by 1850, permanent escape could be extraordinarily difficult because of distance, patrols, slave catchers, local knowledge, and the expansion of slaveholding territory. Still, people tried. The fact that many were caught does not make the attempts less meaningful. It makes the courage harsher to contemplate. Resistance could also be collective, though the plantation worked hard to prevent organised action. Work slowdowns, coordinated feigned illness, shared refusal to reveal information, and mutual help in hiding runaways all relied on trust. Open revolt was rarer in the Cotton South than in slaveholders' nightmares, but the fear of conspiracy haunted white communities constantly. That fear was not entirely fantasy. Enslaved people did discuss escape, retaliation, and rebellion, even when plans never matured or were betrayed. The system generated its own dread because it knew perfectly well what it had done. A quirky detail from some accounts of plantation life is the way humour could attach itself to everyday objects: a broken hat, a mule with a terrible disposition, an overseer's vanity about his boots, a planter's absurd caution around mud. All could become material for shared amusement. Humour does not sound like resistance if you expect resistance to arrive with clenched fists and dramatic music. But laughter among the oppressed can be wonderfully disrespectful. It cuts authority down to human size. Sometimes that is no small thing. Then there were forms of resistance that looked like care. Teaching a child family names, passing along herbal knowledge, warning a young person about an overseer's temper, saving food for someone who had fallen short at the scale, helping a pregnant woman with her chores, sitting up through the night with the sick. These acts may seem private, but they defended the community against the isolating logic of slavery. The plantation relied on weariness, hunger, fear, and division. Mutual care worked against all four. Religion carried its own resistant possibilities. Christian belief among enslaved people did not simply mirror the version slaveholders preferred. White preachers often emphasized obedience, patience, and reward in the next world, hoping to make heaven do the work of social control. Enslaved worshippers heard those messages, but they also found power in stories of deliverance, justice, and divine attention to suffering. Moses mattered. Exodus mattered. The idea that the mighty could be judged mattered very much. At the same time, African spiritual practices and cosmologies continue to shape belief in ways the written record only partially captures. Scholars continue to argue over how visible or hidden these continuities remained in different regions. The uncertainty is real, but so is the evidence of spiritual creativity under pressure. None of this means resistance always felt noble. Sometimes it was frightened, improvised, selfish, angry, or messy. One person might hide food and not share it. Another might protect family first and neighbours second. Someone might sabotage a tool in a way that creates more work for another enslaved labourer. Human beings under terrible conditions do not become morally simple. That complexity belongs in the story too. Resistance is not less real because it is imperfect. What unites these acts is the refusal to surrender completely. The plantation wanted labour, yes, but it also wanted predictability. Resistance disrupted that predictability. A slowed pace, a missing tool, a hidden hog, a whispered warning, a song carrying more than one meaning, a body that would not fully cooperate. All of these created friction. Friction matters in oppressive systems. It forces power to spend more energy enforcing itself. It keeps domination from becoming effortless. There is something else worth noticing. Many of these acts required patience rather than spectacle. To resist in a cotton field often meant waiting for the right moment, understanding personalities, and reading the landscape with care. You needed to know where the tree line gave cover, which path the overseer favoured, when the owner visited, how often stores were counted, who in the quarters could keep silent, and which children could be trusted with an errand. Resistance in such a world was often less like a trumpet blast and more like water working at stone. Quiet, but persistent. So when you ask how black Americans kept working on cotton fields in 1850, the answer cannot be simple obedience. Work continued partly because force was immense, but also because people were constantly adjusting, bargaining, slowing, taking, hiding, joking, praying, teaching, and preserving themselves within the system that tried to own them. Resistance was not always visible from the big house or the ledger book. It lived in hands that did not move quite as fast as commanded, in voices that carried double meanings, in food that vanished from the owner's stores and reappeared in someone's pot, in stories where the weak outsmarted the strong. The field demanded submission. Human beings answered with 1,000 small refusals. When the workday loosens its grip and darkness gathers over the quarters, another world begins to breathe. It is not a world free from slavery. The same people are tired, hungry, watched, and vulnerable. The same cabins stand under the same ownership. Yet night allows a different kind of life to surface, one built less around command and more around one another. This is where community becomes visible, not as a sentimental painting, but as the practical, emotional, and spiritual labour of staying human together. The evening air often feels softer than the field, even when summer heat still lingers in the wood walls. Smoke rises from cabin chimneys in slow blue threads. Firelight moves through cracks and doorways. Voices, lower now, travel across the yard in murmurs and brief laughter. A baby is rocked. A pot is scraped clean. Somewhere a shoe is being repaired by weak light. Somewhere else an old woman is rubbing a swollen ankle with grease or herbs. The plantation may imagine this as downtime, but very little about it is idle. Night in the quarters is busy with care. Care begins with the body. Someone checks a child's feet for thorns. Someone wraps cloth around split fingers. Someone smooths a blanket over an elder already asleep in a chair. A cough is listened to. A forehead is touched. Water is brought. Hair is combed out patiently, even though the hands doing the combing are exhausted too. These actions are small in scale, but enormous in meaning. In a world built on extraction, care becomes a kind of quiet repair, never complete, always needed again. Food still anchors the evening, not only because people are hungry, but because eating together creates a temporary centre. Cornbread broken by hand, greens passed from one bowl to another, a bit of pork carefully divided. Sweet potatoes lifted from the coals, children nudged to eat slowly, adults pretending they are not still hungry so someone smaller can have more. The smells of smoke, meal, and animal fat settle into cloth and hair. You taste ash at the edge of a bite and hardly notice. What matters is warmth and the fact that it is shared. Conversation begins to widen once the urgency of supper eases. Not everyone talks at once. Some people are too tired. Some are naturally quiet. Some listen more than they speak. But words move through the quarters in patterned ways. news from another plantation, a rumour about a sale, a comment about the weather, a complaint about an overseer who has been especially unbearable, a funny detail about a mule that behaved better than its owner. Humour survives here with stubborn grace. It does not erase the misery of the day, but it does rearrange it for a moment, making power look smaller and people look larger. Storytelling holds a special place in this nighttime world. Children gather close. Adults pretend not to lean in, then lean in anyway. Stories may be biblical, local, ancestral, or playful. A clever rabbit outwits a stronger creature. A fool gets punished by his own greed. A proud man discovers that pride is lighter than mud and less useful. The exact shape of the tales varies, but the atmosphere around them feels important. Story creates a room inside the room. It gives the tired mind somewhere else to go while still teaching judgment, memory, and wit. These stories are not merely entertainment, though they are certainly that too. They preserve ways of seeing. They teach children whom to admire and whom to distrust. They show that strength is not always decisive, that a quick mind can matter, that laughter can expose vanity, and that survival sometimes belongs to those who read the world carefully. Historians still argue over how directly some folktales should be interpreted as coded resistance, because not every trickster story is a political manifesto in disguise. That caution is fair. Still, in a society built on unequal power, tales where the weak outmaneuver the strong carry an obvious resonance. Music is often nearby, a hymn, a hum, a hand-tapping rhythm on a bench or knee, a group voice rising together if circumstances allow it. Sound changes after dark. It feels rounder, less forced by labour, more shaped by intention. A work song in the field helps the body endure. A spiritual at night can help the soul remain legible to itself. Some songs carry sorrow plainly. Others hold hope so delicately that it almost disappears unless you listen carefully. Some are about heaven. Some are about home. Some may have meanings that shift with singer, place, and moment. That flexibility is part of their power. Religious life in the quarters often moved along multiple paths at once. Christian faith was deeply important for many enslaved people, but it was rarely the flattened obedience religion slaveholders preferred. Prayer meetings could centre on endurance, justice, deliverance, and divine knowledge of suffering. Biblical stories of bondage and freedom took on living force. At the same time, older African-derived practices, gestures, healing traditions, and spiritual sensibilities continue to shape community life in ways not always easy to document. The written record catches only fragments, often filtered through people who didn't understand what they were seeing. Even so, the fragments are enough to show that spiritual life was creative, layered, and communal. In some places, gatherings happened secretly in the woods or in more hidden corners, away from direct white supervision. These meetings, later often called hush arbors, became spaces for prayer, song, and emotional release. People might turn a pot upside down at the door or place cloth against cracks to soften sound. The image is deeply moving. Tired bodies stealing a little privacy from a world that denied privacy as a rule. Whether every plantation had such meetings is uncertain, and scholars remain cautious about how often they occurred in different regions. But where they did occur, they offered something very rare in plantation life collective expression, not fully staged for the master's eye. Community also depends on teaching. Night is when much practical knowledge circulates. How to set a snare, which herb eases stomach pain, how to patch a sleeve so it lasts longer, how to read the weather by smell and cloud shape, how to judge whether an overseer is in a punishing mood before he speaks, which route between properties is safest if a message must be carried, which white people are merely arrogant and which are dangerous in deeper ways. Children absorb all this, even when adults think they are only half listening. There is a lovely stubbornness in the way beauty appears under such conditions. Hair is braided with care. A song is tuned well, not merely sung. A quilt is pieced from scraps with attention to pattern. A name is spoken with affection. Courtship continues. People tease one another. Someone wears a head wrap tied just so because even in bondage, a person may still refuse to look defeated if there is any cloth available to help it. These are not luxuries. They are forms of self-making, courtship and marriage carry great emotional weight in the quarters because enslaved marriages lacked legal protection. Affection lived under the threat of sale and separation. Even so, couples formed lasting bonds, visited when allowed, made homes in the spaces available, and raised children with deep commitment. On some plantations, a husband and wife lived in the same cabin. On others, one spouse had to walk at night from a neighbouring property for a brief visit, then leave before dawn. Imagine the tenderness and strain of that arrangement. Love measured not by convenience, but by distance, exhaustion, and the willingness to keep crossing both. Elders matter enormously in this social world. Even when their bodies are no longer strongest in the field, they carry memory. They remember births, deaths, kin ties, sales, moves, and old names. They settle disputes. They watch children. They tell stories that position the present within a longer line of suffering and endurance. In communities under constant threat of rupture, memory itself becomes a kind of shelter. An elder who can tell a child who their people are is doing something larger than conversation. They are resisting disappearance. That resistance to disappearance also appears in naming practices. A child may be named for a grandparent, an aunt, a biblical figure, or someone lost to sale. A nickname may carry humour, affection, or hidden critique. Names move through the quarters with more flexibility than plantation records allow. The ledger wants fixed categories. Community prefers living language. There is power in that difference. A quirky but revealing detail from some recollections is the presence of handmade fiddles, drums adapted under constraint, bone instruments, or improvised noisemakers used for music and dance when conditions allowed. Planters were often suspicious of drums and gatherings, especially after slave revolts elsewhere had frightened them. Even so, rhythm found its way into life through hands, feet, strings, and voices. The body itself became an instrument when instruments were denied. That feels appropriate somehow. If the system insists on owning your labour, you answer by making sound out of your own movement. Community does not mean harmony all the time. People argued, jealousies flared, children fought, adults gossiped, romantic disappointments hurt, resentments built over borrowed tools, noisy neighbours, stolen food, and unreturned favours. Chronic fatigue does not make anyone sweeter. It usually makes everyone slightly worse. Historians are right to resist turning the quarters into a sentimental haven, untouched by ordinary human conflict. What made these communities remarkable was not perfection. It was durability. That durability depended on mutual recognition. In the field, the plantation sees labouring bodies. At night, people see one another more fully. They know who sings low when sad, who limps when rain is coming, who misses a child sold away years ago and still pauses at certain names, who can calm a frightened infant, who makes jokes when tension gets too thick, who prays out loud, who prays silently, who has learned the healing plants, who remembers the old stories best. Community is built out of that knowledge, repeated night after night. Even when tomorrow promises more of the same hardship, there is another important truth here. The quarters are not outside history's larger forces. Cotton prices, planter debts, land hunger, the domestic slave trade, and political conflict over slavery all shape this nighttime world. Even when the people gathered around the fire do not speak in those formal terms. A sale rumour travels because markets move. A family fears separation because debts exist. A man is hired out because labour demand shifts. The global cotton economy reaches all the way into a dim cabin where someone is mending a shirt by firelight. That is how large systems work. They arrive in personal form, and yet the quarters answer those forces with something the market cannot fully calculate. Loyalty, memory, shared humour, spiritual life, child rearing, skill transmission, grief held in company, music, care. These things do not stop the plantation from claiming tomorrow's labour, but they do explain how people survived psychologically and socially inside a regime meant to thin them down to usefulness. Community was not a decorative extra to enslaved life. It was one of the main conditions of endurance. So as night deepens over the cabins, You can hear the quieter heartbeat of the plantation, not in the gin house or the ledger, but in the human world the plantation never fully mastered, a prayer murmured into dark, a child falling asleep against a warm shoulder, a joke shared over nearly empty bowls, a story crossing from elder to youngster, a song hovering just above a whisper. This is how people gathered themselves again after being scattered by the day. Not perfectly, not safely, but together enough to face another dawn. By 1850, the cotton field keeps going for reasons that are both brutally simple and terribly wide. At the centre is force. That must remain clear. Black Americans did not keep working in cotton because the work was accepted as fair, natural, or chosen. They kept working because slavery in the United States had become a mature and expanding system of compulsion, backed by law, money, violence, and habit. The field continued because a whole society had arranged itself to make stopping extraordinarily difficult. That is the first truth, and any softer explanation risks becoming an insult. Cotton had become one of the most profitable crops in the world. That sentence can sound dry on the page, almost harmless, until you place it back into human terms. Profit meant land cleared by forced labour. Profit meant people bought, sold, moved, weighed, punished, and driven. Profit meant ports busy with bales, merchants extending credit, mills waiting for fibre, and planters calculating how many hands they could squeeze across one more season. A cotton plantation in the Deep South was never just a local farm. It was tied into a broad network of commerce that stretched across states and oceans. The rows in front of you belonged to a much larger appetite. That appetite shaped the map itself. Enslaved labour had already been pushed west and south in huge numbers by 1850, especially into Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, and eastern Texas. Families were uprooted through the domestic slave trade and sent into newer cotton regions where fresh land promised new fortunes. The phrase new land sounds innocent enough until you remember what it usually meant. Indigenous people had been dispossessed. Forests had been cut back. Human beings had been marched or shipped into bondage under new owners. Expansion in the Cotton Kingdom was not some adventurous frontier tale. It was organised displacement layered upon organised exploitation. The legal system helped hold it all in place. Enslaved people could not simply decide to leave the field because the law largely refused to recognise their right to govern their own bodies. Property law, slave patrols, courts, local militias, jail systems, and interstate cooperation all strengthened the master's claim. Even people who did not own slaves often participated in maintaining the regime through politics, trade, transportation, and racial hierarchy. Slavery did not survive in 1850 because of a few cruel individuals acting alone. It survived because institutions defended it. A whip in the field mattered. So did a judge in town. So did a banker. So did a merchant counting future bales before the crop was even gathered. Debt played a surprisingly large role in keeping the system moving. Planters borrowed money against land, crops, and enslaved people. Credit flowed on the expectation that future cotton would pay present obligations. That meant a bad harvest, a fall in prices, or poor labour output could threaten more than one season's comfort. It could threaten the entire financial structure around a plantation. Under such conditions, owners had every incentive to drive labour harder, not less. Human suffering became a way to reassure lenders. There is something especially bleak in that. A bent back in the field could be translated into confidence in a distant office. Cotton also had a tyrannical relationship to time. The crop demanded planting, tending, picking, ginning, baling, and shipment on a seasonal schedule. When the weather was right, labour had to intensify. When the crop opened, it could not simply be left waiting out of kindness to exhausted hands. The plant itself became part of the pressure system, not because cotton was evil, but because slaveholders organised human life around the demands of the plant and the market attached to it. Nature and commerce were braided together in a way that always tightened around the enslaved person first. Still, force and profit do not explain everything on their own. The field kept going partly because enslaved people were compelled, but also because they developed ways to endure within compulsion. Endurance is not the same thing as consent. It is closer to a stubborn, daily refusal to collapse entirely under conditions designed to break you. People worked because they had to, yes, but they also worked while raising children, protecting family ties, preserving memory, creating beauty, making food from little, healing one another, joking, praying, and resisting where they could. If slavery depended on coercion, survival depended on human skill. Family sat at the center of that skill. The plantation tried to use households as labor reservoirs, but households were also places of care, instruction, and emotional repair. A child learned how to move through danger from parents, grandparents, siblings, and neighbors. An exhausted worker returned to a world where someone might share food, dress a wound, or simply say a needed word. Love did not defeat slavery, which is an important thing to say plainly, but it did help people live inside it without becoming only what the system wanted them to be. A family could not stop the field from calling at dawn. It could make dawn more bearable. Community widened that support. No one survived a plantation alone in any full sense. Shared labour knowledge, mutual aid, songs, spiritual gatherings, midwifery, herbal medicine, storytelling, and collective memory all helped sustain life. This social fabric mattered economically as well, though slaveholders rarely admitted it. A labour force stayed functional not simply through punishment, but because enslaved people fed, nursed, taught, and steadied one another beyond what owners provided. The plantation stole labour directly and benefited indirectly from unpaid care all around it. It was a greedy arrangement, taking not just the work of the field, but the hidden labour that made more field work possible. Race ideology also helped keep the system in motion. White supremacy offered moral cover to people who needed to believe their wealth rested on something other than organised theft. It trained ordinary white Southerners, including many who owned no slaves, to see black labour as naturally subordinate and black freedom as threatening. That belief did practical work. It justified patrols, silences, exclusions, and political loyalty to slavery. It made cruelty sound like order. It made profit sound like civilization. People often imagine ideology as a cloud of bad ideas floating above real life. In fact, it often functions like furniture, shaping the room so thoroughly that many people forget it is there. And then there was repetition. One day leads to another. One season prepares the next. Children grow into workers. Habits become expectations. Fear becomes routine. Routine becomes the background condition of existence. This is one of the saddest answers to the question. The field kept going because the system trained the living to organize themselves around its demands, whether willingly or not. The horn sounds, bodies rise, tools are found, food is stretched, rows are entered. At a certain point, repetition itself becomes a form of power. Not moral power, just the deadening force of what has happened so many times that the impossible begins to look ordinary. Yet ordinary did not mean uncontested. Slaveholders feared resistance constantly because they knew their order rested on unstable ground. People ran away, people slowed down, people stole, lied, warned, sabotaged, remembered, and imagined differently. Open revolt was rare and dangerous, but the fear of it haunted the slave South. Why? Because those in power understood that the field only worked as long as the people in it could be controlled. Underneath the appearance of stability lay an enormous insecurity. A system that must watch this closely is a system that knows it is hated. Women help explain this hidden instability with particular force. They were labourers, caregivers, cooks, mothers, healers, seamstresses, gardeners, and carriers of community knowledge, often all at once. The plantation depended heavily on women's work while also intruding into pregnancy, motherhood, and domestic life. A woman in the Cotton South was expected to sustain both labour production and household survival under coercion. That double demand reveals how total slavery wanted to be. Yet it also reveals how much depended on skills owners could not easily command into existence. You can order a woman into a field. You cannot so easily order the patience, judgment, tenderness, and practical intelligence required to hold a household together afterward. Those had to come from the people themselves. Men, too, were forced into impossible balances. They were expected to perform strength, endure punishment, protect loved ones where possible, and navigate a world where formal authority was denied them. Masculinity under slavery carried humiliation built into its structure. A father could love his children fiercely and still be unable to shield them from sale. A husband could work himself sick and still not control where his wife slept if she belonged to another owner. Yet men continued to build families, share knowledge, court partners, repair tools, tell stories, and make claims on dignity however they could. The field took much from them, but not every inward thing. Children reveal the future tense of the system. The reason cotton kept going in 1850 was not only that adults were working then, it was also that children were being drawn steadily into labour, discipline, and plantation knowledge. A little girl carrying water or minding a baby was already being trained into usefulness. A boy learning rows and rhythms was being folded into tomorrow's workforce. This generational capture gave slavery its endurance. It was not living off one exhausted cohort alone. It was reproducing labour socially, domestically, and coercively at the same time. There is a strange little irony in all this. The same system that bragged about efficiency relied constantly on things it could not fully control: weather, soil, insects, disease, birth, death, moods, loyalties, rumours, and the inner life of enslaved people. A planter might own land, tools, and bodies in law, yet still lie awake worrying about rain, rot, debt, resistance, overseer incompetence, and cotton prices. Slavery projected confidence. But much of that confidence was staged. Beneath it lived anxiety. A fortune built on forced labour is still a fragile fortune if the labourers hate the arrangement and nature refuses to cooperate. Historians continue to argue over emphasis. Was cotton's persistence driven most by the world market, by southern political power, by local plantation management, by the reproductive growth of the enslaved population, or by the expansion of credit and land? The honest answer is that these forces intertwined. No single cause carried the whole burden. Markets created incentive, law provided protection, violence maintained discipline, racism offered justification, family and community enabled survival, geography and climate made cotton possible, debt intensified extraction. The system endured because many forms of power reinforced one another at once, and yet for all that scale, the truth still comes back to human bodies in rows. A global market cannot pick its own cotton, a legal code cannot hoe a field, a banknote cannot drag a sack. Every broad explanation must finally bend down to the level of hands, feet, lungs, skin, and memory. Black Americans kept working on cotton fields in 1850 because a nation had built an enormous machine to force that work, and because the people caught inside that machine somehow continued to live, adapt, care, and endure within it. The first part is the crime. The second part is the human miracle. Now the night grows gentler around the cabins and fields. The dust of the day begins to settle in your mind. You can let the hard edges soften a little. Imagine the cotton rows under moonlight, no longer a place of shouted commands, but quiet for a few hours at least. The air cools. The insects carry the sound now. A low fire gives off its last warm glow. Someone nearby hums, not for work this time, but simply because the darkness invites softer things. You do not need to hold every fact tightly anymore. Let them drift into a calmer shape. Think of tired hands finally resting. Think of a child asleep under a patched blanket. Think of the smell of wood smoke fading into the night air. Think of voices growing lower, then fewer, then still. The field remains where it is, but for this moment it is distant, blurred by darkness and quiet. The story settles here with the people who endured it, not as symbols, not as shadows in white cotton, but as human beings with breath, memory, pain, tenderness, wit, and will. The night holds them gently for a little while. Their labour was forced, but their inner lives were never fully owned. Their care for one another, their songs, their prayers, their humour, and their endurance remain the softest and strongest truth in the dark. So let the scene grow dimmer now. The cabins rest under the wide southern sky. The fire lowers to embers. The last murmurs slip away. Even the rows seem quieter. You can leave the field at the edge of sleep with the night air cooling your thoughts and the weight of the day finally ease in, rest there, where history grows hushed, and let the silence close around the cotton like a blanket.